For most of human history, nearly everyone lived on less than $2 a day. For thousands of years, global progress barely registered. It was a flat line of poverty, life expectancies under 30, and almost no upward mobility. But then something changed so dramatically that world GDP per capita exploded from just $600 before 1800 to tens of thousands of dollars today. How did a world trapped in scarcity become unimaginably rich? The full story is not what you think. The real reasons will upend everything you thought you knew about prosperity. This is where the mystery of global wealth truly begins. Richness in the story of civilization is more than a feeling of comfort or a pile of gold coins. Economists measure it by tracking the average income each person earns in a given year, what is called gross domestic product per capita. For almost all of history, this number barely moved. From the year 1000 through 1800, the average person in Europe or Asia lived on the equivalent of just $400 to $600 a year, adjusted for modern prices. That is less than the cost of a smartphone today. Life expectancy offers another window into prosperity. Before 1800, most people around the world could expect to live only about 30 years. Epidemics, hunger, and war kept populations in check. Even as some kingdoms grew richer, more children simply meant more mouths to feed, so the average person stayed poor. This cycle, known as the Malthusian trap, held societies in place for centuries. Literacy rates tell a similar story. In 1800, fewer than 1 in 5 adults in most countries could read or write. Cities were rare, less than 10% of people lived in urban areas. Most worked the land, planting and harvesting by hand, with little hope of changing their fate. The world was locked in a pattern where progress for a few never spread to the many. The Madison Project, a global effort to reconstruct historical economic data, shows a flat line for centuries. The chart of world GDP per capita from the year 1000 to 1800 is almost perfectly horizontal. Then, after 1820, something dramatic happens. In Britain, average incomes triple within a century. Life expectancy in Europe rises from 30 to over 50 years by 1900. Literacy soars. Cities swell. The world average GDP per person climbs from $667 in 1820 to $1,525 by 1900, and then accelerates even faster. This is not just a story of numbers, it is a story of everyday lives transformed, families eating better, children surviving to adulthood, workers learning to read, and entire cities springing up where there were once only fields. The mystery at the heart of economic history is why, after thousands of years of stasis, nearly every indicator of human well-being took off at once. Understanding that explosion, the sudden upward curve on every chart, means looking for the forces that broke the old pattern and set the world on a new path. Subscribe to Empire Economic Stories for more economic history insights. Roughly 12,000 years ago, scattered bands of hunter-gatherers began to settle down and plant crops. The first wheat and barley fields appeared in the Fertile Crescent, while rice and millet took root in China and Southeast Asia. Agriculture spread slowly, reshaping the land and the lives of those who worked it. By producing more food than they could eat, early farmers created something new in human history: surplus. This surplus allowed people to store grain against famine, support larger families, and free up a small share of the population to do something other than farm. Villages grew into towns. Some people became potters, weavers, or metalworkers, trading their goods for bread and vegetables. Others organized irrigation, built temples, or collected taxes. Hierarchies formed, and the first cities rose along the Nile, the Tigris, the Indus, and the Yellow River. Writing systems emerged to track harvests and debts. Yet for all these changes, most people remain tied to the soil, their fortunes still shaped by the weather and the whims of nature. Over time, networks of exchange stretched farther. By the first millennium BCE, caravans carried silk, spices, and precious stones across deserts and mountains. The Silk Road linked China to the Mediterranean, passing through bustling hubs like Samarkand and Baghdad. At its height, the Silk Road was not a single path, but a web of routes, moving goods, ideas, and technologies between East and West. In the south, ships navigated the monsoon winds of the Indian Ocean, connecting ports from East Africa to India and Southeast Asia. Merchants traded pepper, ivory, textiles, and gold, creating fortunes and fueling the growth of great trading cities. These ancient routes stitched together a vast Eurasian world. Empires and kingdoms thrived on the wealth that flowed through their markets and customs posts. But even as trade flourished, most people remained poor by modern standards. Surplus farming and commerce supported larger populations and more specialized work. But they did not break the cycle of low average incomes. For centuries, prosperity was fragile, always at risk from drought, war, or disease. The foundations of wealth were in place: agriculture, cities, and long-distance trade, but the world had not yet found a way to raise living standards for everyone or to escape the limits set by nature and tradition. Coal dust settled on the streets of Newcastle and Manchester as Britain's factories began to hum with new energy. In the mid-1700s, coal was more than just a fuel. It was the foundation for a new kind of economy. Deep seams lay close to the surface, and as forests dwindled, coal became the cheapest way to power engines and heat homes. Where wood had once limited growth, coal unlocked a surge in output. In Lancashire, demand for cotton thread pushed inventors to find ways to spin faster and cheaper. In 1764, James Hargreaves built the spinning jenny, a wooden frame that let one worker spin 8 threads at once. For families who had relied on hand spinning, this machine was both a marvel and a threat. Diaries from mill workers in the 1790s describe 14-hour shifts, the clatter of machinery, and the strange sense of watching human skill replaced by iron and wood. The economics behind these inventions were as important as the machines themselves. British wages were among the highest in the world, up to twice those in France and 5 times those in China. At the same time, coal near the northern mills cost a fraction of what it did on the continent. For a factory owner, every hour of a worker's time was expensive, but every ton of coal was cheap. This wages and coal ratio made it profitable to invest in labor-saving machines. Where a French or Chinese entrepreneur might keep hiring hands, a British mill owner bought another jenny or a new engine. The numbers tell the story. In 1770, a ton of coal in Manchester cost about 12 shillings, while a spinner earned 20 pence a day. Mechanization paid off because energy was cheap and labor was dear. By 1776, James Watt's steam engine was ready for the market. Watt's engine used coal to drive pistons, turning wheels and powering looms far from any river. Over 100 engines dotted the landscape by 1800, clustered near coal fields where transport costs were lowest. The Bridgewater Canal, finished in 1761, cut coal prices in Manchester by 3/4, fueling more factories and longer workdays. For workers, the promise of steady wages came with new risks, accidents, a relentless pace, and the loss of old skills. One Lancashire spinner said, "The machine does not tire, nor does it sleep." As output soared, the limits of tradition fell away, Cotton cloth poured from the mills, and Britain's share of global manufacturing climbed. But this leap forward was built on a simple equation. When coal is cheap and wages are high, machines become the engine of prosperity. The next challenge would be finding the money and credit to build even bigger factories and to spread these inventions beyond the coal fields. In 1694, a group of London merchants and politicians struck a deal with the crown that would reshape the flow of money and power. They founded the Bank of England. With a charter to lend £1.2 million to the government, the bank created a new kind of public credit. For the first time, the state could borrow on a scale that matched its ambitions, funding wars, infrastructure, and overseas ventures with paper promises backed by future taxes. This system of national debt, once controversial, became the backbone of British finance. Parliamentary debates raged over the risks of concentrating power in moneyed interests, but the rewards proved irresistible. At the same time, the English East India Company, chartered in 1600, pioneered the joint stock model. Thousands of investors pooled their savings, spreading risk across distant voyages to Asia. The East India Company's directors, elected by shareholders, managed a private army, minted coins, and negotiated treaties. Profits from spices, tea, and textiles flowed back to London, paying out steady dividends and swelling the city's real estate market. Company records show that by the late 1700s, dividends from the East India Company alone reached millions of pounds, with fortunes built on both trade and extraction. The mechanics of joint stock capital allowed Britain and the Dutch Republic to mobilize sums that dwarfed those of older empires. Amsterdam's bourse, fueled by shares in the Dutch East India Company and the East India Company, became the financial heart of Europe. Merchant ledgers from the era list investments in canals, docks, and insurance, ventures that would have been impossible for a single family or guild. The ability to sell shares or borrow against them turned capital into a liquid force, ready to jump into the next opportunity. Plantation economies in the Caribbean and the American South funneled wealth to Europe on a massive scale. Sugar, coffee, and tobacco, grown by enslaved labor, generated profits that reached as much as 5% of Britain's national income at their peak. Shipping logs and insurance registers track millions of pounds flowing from colonial ports into London's banks and Liverpool's shipping firms. These funds financed new factories, railways, and the expansion of the British Navy. Silver from the mines of Potosi in present-day Bolivia poured into Spanish coffers between 1545 and 1700, with more than 40,000 tons extracted under brutal conditions. While much of this bullion passed through Spain and paid for Asian goods, a significant share ended up in the hands of Dutch, French, and British merchants. The silver-fueled trade boosted credit and circulated as currency, multiplying the reach of European finance. The scale and speed of these flows, credit from the Bank of England, dividends from the East India Company, profits from plantations, and silver from the Americas, gave Europe the resources to build factories, fund inventions, and dominate global trade. The machinery of modern capitalism ran not just on coal and steam, but on the relentless movement of capital and commodities across continents. Subscribe to Empire Economic Stories for more economic history insights. In 1978, a new chapter began for China. After decades of isolation and economic stagnation, Deng Xiaoping stepped forward with a plan that would upend the old order. Instead of clinging to central planning, Deng argued for what he called reform and opening up. The first major experiment took place along the country's southern coast in a fishing village called Shenzhen. Here, the government set up a special economic zone, an area where foreign investment was welcome, private businesses could operate, and market incentives would be tested on Chinese soil. The changes came quickly. In just a few years, factories started to rise where rice paddies once stood. By the mid-1980s, Shenzhen's population had multiplied tenfold, and goods stamped "Made in China" began to appear in shops around the world. The government used these zones as laboratories, watching which policies attracted investment and created jobs. When local officials reported double-digit growth and swelling export orders, party leaders expanded the model to other cities, including Shanghai and Xiamen. Deng's approach was pragmatic. "It does not matter whether a cat is black or white," he famously said, "as long as it catches mice." The focus was on results. Rural families were allowed to lease land and sell surplus crops. State firms gained more autonomy. Entrepreneurs started small workshops, and within a generation, millions left farming for city jobs. Between 1978 and 2020, China's GDP per capita soared from about $450 to over $12,500, a 30-fold increase. Hundreds of millions rose out of poverty. The momentum did not stop at the border. In 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization, committing to global trade rules and opening its markets wider than ever before. Exports surged, growing by more than 20% per year for much of the next decade. Factories in Guangdong and Jiangsu became the backbone of global supply chains, sending electronics, clothing, and machinery to every continent. Shenzhen, once a rural backwater, became a metropolis of skyscrapers and tech startups. China's rapid rise challenged old assumptions about how quickly a country could catch up. The transformation was not just about cheap labor, but about institutional change, rules, and incentives that unleashed new energy. The world watched as a nation of over 1 billion people accelerated along the path from poverty to prosperity, reshaping the global economy in the process. Subscribe to Empire Economic Stories for more economic history insights. In 1956, Malcolm McLean watched as 58 metal containers were hoisted onto the deck of the Ideal X. That quiet experiment would upend the world's trade. Within a few decades, the cost to ship goods across oceans collapsed by more than 90%. A ton of freight from New York to Rotterdam, once $5.83 in the 1950s, cost just 16 cents by the 1980s. Container ships, now floating cities of steel, could move thousands of tons with a fraction of the labor and time. Suddenly, electronics from Shenzhen, cars from Japan, and shirts from Bangladesh could reach markets continents away. Global trade routes pulsed with new energy, their volume swelling year after year. But efficiency came with a price. As containers multiplied and supply chains stretched across the globe, another line on the chart began to climb. Global carbon dioxide emissions, once steady, surged alongside gross domestic product. Since 1850, carbon dioxide output has soared by over 1,000%, mirroring the world's hunger for energy and goods. The same forces that lifted millions from poverty also left a mark on the atmosphere. Animated graphs show gross domestic product and emissions rising together, while another chart reveals a widening gap between rich and poor. In this era, inequality, both within and between nations, became a defining feature of economic life. The roots of modern wealth remain hotly debated. Daron Acemoglu and James Robinson argue that institutions, including rules, property rights, and predictable law, form the bedrock of growth. Their research compares countries with similar geography or resources but starkly different outcomes, pointing to the power of incentives and governance. Others credit technology, from steam engines to microchips, or the luck of geography and natural resources. Some focus on trade, extraction, and the legacy of colonial empires. Animated diagrams weigh these theories, but no single cause stands alone. The evidence suggests a web of factors, institutions, innovation, resources, and chance, woven differently across time and place. The logistics revolution, with its steel containers and vast networks, stands as both a marvel of ingenuity and a warning about the costs of progress. The world grew richer, but the rewards and burdens were never shared equally. The story of economic growth is written not just in ships and factories, but in the air itself. Subscribe to Empire Economic Stories for more economic history insights. Today, the richest 10% of countries hold over 70% of global income, while billions remain vulnerable to economic shocks. The engines that built prosperity also deepened divides. As technology and globalization accelerate, the foundations of wealth and the costs of inequality are more visible than ever. The true measure of progress now is not just how rich the world becomes, but who gets to share in it. Subscribe to Empire Economic Stories for more economic history insights,